All right. Well, welcome back from lunch, everybody. I had something sort of funny
Again.
to say. While we were taking our photo. Anna here said we're becoming a cult, and it, it can't be a cult. It's not sustainable unless you get new members, right? So it's so nice to be part of and to have this session as part of what we're all here for. This is the Emerging Scholars session. I'd just like to set this up and say a few words about each paper. Oh, I left my paper up there. Hold on. So another really nice thing about this is that we have such an international slate of researchers here, and it really speaks to us becoming a worldwide cult. So our first paper this afternoon will be from Yasmira Wiersma, and she's going to speak with us about financial literacy and economic behavior in Curacao. This is a really cool paper. Uses some new data, and it compares those data to data that you might be more familiar with from developing and developed nations. So I really enjoyed reading that one. Then we'll hear from Josie Xiao, and she'll lead us on an exploration of whether retirement planning tools are substitutes or complements for financial planning. And I'd like you to think about the paper that we saw yesterday, Tabia's paper, as you're listening to this paper. It's very exciting to have both of those papers here on with us these next 2 days, over these 2 days. And then our final paper will be Sebastian Gomez Cardona. He's going to look at fertility, financial literacy, and household portfolios. This is a very exciting paper. It looks at a lot of dynamics around a critical stage in not only financial life, but of course in terms of the life cycle, the birth of a child, and how financial portfolios adapt to that. So without further ado, I'll say that each of these will be 15 minutes for the presentation, and then we'll have 5 minutes for questions. We should have a few minutes at the end as well, so keep those questions coming. And yes, Mira, if you'd come up, this would be a great time. Welcome.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here at the conference. So my name is Jasmira Wiersma, and I am from the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And today I will be presenting my paper, Financial Literacy and Economic Behavior in Curacao. So I'm not originally from Curacao, I'm from Aruba, which is the neighboring island of Curacao. So if you're wondering where is Curacao, Curacao is an island in the Dutch Caribbean part of the Caribbean Sea. So it was formerly one of the 6 islands that belonged to the Netherlands Antilles. And these were colonies of the Netherlands, but since 2010, Curacao, together with Aruba a bit before, and St. Martin became autonomous countries to some degree within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And Curacao in particular has a very diverse population with about 160 nationalities in a population of about 150,000 people. So this is a little bit of Curacao, and as you may see, we're very close to Venezuela and Latin America. So a little bit about the motivation behind the paper. Well, the cost of living crisis has put a magnifying glass on households' financial fragility. And for Curacao, it goes much further than being just another crisis. It puts a magnifying glass on issues that were already there, such as poverty. Prior to the pandemic, 1 in 3 individuals were already living below the poverty line. And as we know, poverty is especially relevant for retirees, the unemployed, female parented single households, and the lowly educated. And as we see, these households more often make unsound financial decisions, such as not having retirement savings, not holding emergency funds, and so on. And this places them at a further economic disadvantage. As you may see here, what this paper says in Dutch, because on the islands we speak a lot of Dutch, it says Curacao already had an enormous poverty problem, and Corona makes it even bigger. And this article was published in a Dutch newspaper in the Netherlands. moreover, so in addition to the poverty problem, there's also a huge debt problems with many households struggling or being over indebted. This research by the Central Bank of Curacao in St. Martin shows that in 2000, we see a rising trend in household debt. And also in 2070, the debt to income ratio of households was about 94%. And the Central Bank of Curacao in St. Martin attributes this to not only economic challenges, but also an unhealthy lending culture on the islands, what we see here. So it has long been understood that financial literacy, I don't have to talk a lot about this, can increase a household's financial resilience, especially in times of economic crisis. However, despite this growing evidence, there are no international comparable data in the Caribbean in total, or it's very scarce. And there's also this data gap in Curacao. So this was the motivation behind collecting this data. And why? Because we see that, so some papers have said, and we know that to build evidence-based, efficient financial education programs, policymakers should, and program designers must have an understanding of the level of financial literacy, financial behaviors, and how they are related. So this brings me to our research questions. What we wanted to do in this research is answer the following questions, which is how well equipped are the citizens of Curacao to make informed financial decisions? What is their level of financial literacy? And who knows the most and who knows the least? And are financial literacy measures associated with savvy financial behaviors? In doing so, we can identify the groups at risk and answer our main questions, in essence, what and who should be targeted through policy initiatives. So the data of this survey stems from a telephone interview that was conducted in the Sonoro panel in the summer and fall of 2020. And the Sonoro panel is a panel of households in Curacao where members are consulted on topics related to finance and health over different periods of time. So after this presentation, I can talk a bit more about the Sonoro panel because it was also something I set up during my PhD studies, where what we did is we had 2,900, a sample of 2,900 coordinates, and we placed them on a satellite view map and then visited each of these households to participate in the panel. So this was the beginning. However, the working sample, we only have 225 completed interviews. Why? Because it was during a time of COVID, and we could only approach households with a known telephone number. So this working sample only has respondents with an 18 years or older. And we have demographic and socioeconomic data, which stems from the recruitment interview that we did at the beginning that was held in 2018 and 2019, where we had about 1,700 respondents. So the panel initially had 1,700 respondents. Despite this smaller sample, we see in a paper, this Viz et al., which describes the setup of this panel, we observe that this sample is representative of the population in terms of gender, income, and place of birth. And what was very important is that this survey was also available in all 4 languages that are spoken on the island. So in Curacao, we speak 4 languages: Papiamento, which is the native one, Spanish, Dutch, and English. So in the survey, we measured both subjective and objective financial literacy, as we know that there are both critical components in understanding differences in financial literacy, in financial behavior, sorry. And the questions for to measure objective financial literacy stem from the S&P Global FinLit survey, and these are similar to the Big 3 questions. So yes, that's a bit about how we measure the financial literacy. Okay, so moving on to the results, what we see is knowledge of inflation is quite high, even if we compare it to the neighboring islands and also islands, countries in Latin America. However, if we look at inflation and risk diversification, especially the, interest, especially the findings on the workings of interest were quite sobering, with less than 60% getting the answers correct. What we also see, how do I point this? What we also see is that less than 1 in 3 had, if we take the financial literacy index and we categorize those with 3 or more answers correct as being financial literate, less than 1 in 3 were categorized as being financial literate. Also, we see that 30% rate their understanding as being good. However, only 37% of these people had all 3 questions correctly. So that might signal overconfidence. So many numbers, but 2 things that I want to highlight here. One thing we should keep in mind, one caveat, is this number of observations. But what is interesting is that we see that here, a gender gap in the knowledge of interest, and this gap is almost 16%, even when we account for education, income, and also some other variables in this model. And we see that women are significantly less interest literate than males. We do not see a gender gap for the financial literacy index. We also see that educational attainment here plays a role. And what is also good to highlight is that the individuals with only elementary education are significantly less literate than those with higher levels of education. We see here almost a 25 percentage point difference between those with secondary education only at the first level and those with only elementary education. Then we also asked the respondents about account ownership and also their debt behavior. And we included more formal and also less formal methods of borrowing. And 2 things that I want to highlight here, what we also highlighted a bit more in the paper, is the riskier types of lending. So here we see that 16% had a loan at an institution other than the bank. And what is concerning over here is when we asked these questions, we gave respondents examples of local institutions on the island that provided short-term loans at very high rates. And what we also see is that almost 16% had purchased on credit. And 30% or about 30% also had already trouble living on their income prior to the pandemic. Here I highlight only some of our findings, not all of the ones I show here. What we see is that both objective and subjective financial literacy are correlated to saving and debt behavior. We see stark differences between who knows the most and who knows the least. And we see that individuals, again, what is concerning is that individuals who hold the riskier types of debt have little understanding of the workings of interest. Only 11% of those who have purchased on credit got the interest question correct. And we also see here in the bivariate analysis that interest seems to be the more prominent factor when it comes to these decisions. Here I only show savings account, but these findings were also similar to actually actively saving. So then we estimate multivariate analysis and models, and we see here, again, they mainly confirm the findings of the bivariate analysis, but here what we want to highlight is, again, that interest and self-assessed financial literacy seems to be the prominent factors in saving or in financial decision making. And the interest, especially the interest concept, seems to be a strong predictor of having risky debts, and also savings account ownership, also not shown here, but also actively saving. And these associations, what I want to highlight, they remain significant even after controlling for education, income, and self-assessed financial literacy. So then we also do some sensitivity analysis where we added some extra control variables, and we also did 3 alternative specifications for the models, including proxies for procrastination, the influence of social networks, and the locus of control. And what we see is that procrastination and the influence of social networks also play a role in financial decision making, especially the influence of social networks, where we asked respondents whether overspending is acceptable among their family members and friends. And we see that those where it is acceptable, 42 percentage points more likely to take on risky debts. However, despite the inclusion of these proxies and other variables, we do see that our coefficients for interest literacy and self-assessed financial literacy remain significant. So these seem to be the prominent factors. So to conclude, what we find is less than 1 in 3 show an understanding of basic financial concepts, and particularly the findings of the knowledge of interest are quite sobering, keeping in mind that 16% also have risky debts. Who knows the least? We find that the lowly educated, especially those with elementary education, are significantly less literate. Elders and low-income individuals score lower on both objective and subjective financial literacy. And we see that both knowledge and confidence play a role in financial decision making, and investing in financial knowledge seems to be a particular type of human capital, as its impact goes above and beyond that of education. So we provide some recommendations. The first one is that policymakers should focus on addressing gaps in financial literacy, and attention should especially be placed on the workings of interest. These can be tackled through financial education programs at different levels, so at schools, and also what is very known on the islands are Casa de Barrios, which are community centers where we can reach the harder to reach groups. And these should start as early as possible, because Curacao has a dropout rate of 40%, so that's quite high. And policymakers should also consider looking in international best practices. And what I want to say is that these individual behavior-focused interventions should be complemented by interventions in other areas, such as further financial regulation, and also a credit rating agency, for example, might benefit the island. So finally, what I want to say, what is next? So this was the first step. We have still access to the original sample. So what we want to do is go again to the 2,900 households, approach them again, and then do this study again with a larger sample, now that we are able to do face-to-face interviewing again. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation, very interesting. I was curious about how you so if you can come back to the table with the econometric here? Yes, no, the second one. Yes, this one. So I was curious about how you interpret the fact that despite the limited number of observation, you have a R-square pretty low. I think 11% means that about 90% of your heterogeneity is unexplained. So I wanted to understand if you explored that, for example, what happens when you had the additional covariates, and also I would be curious about how this unobserved heterogeneity change for example, by gender. So making it would be very interesting, in my opinion, doing something like a Oaxaca decomposition analysis in order to understand if there are differences under this point of view. Thanks.
Yes, thank you for your question. And we indeed did some extra analysis, and yeah, the R square is quite low, but keep in mind still the sample is quite small. So with the further study, we do want to do this again and see, okay, what can we do with a larger sample size? Yes.
Okay, if I have one. Oh, please, go ahead.
One thing that you mentioned is that the survey was during kind of COVID times. So I know your sample was disadvantaged to begin with, but are you worried a little bit about who's answering? So selection bias into that sample, or can you look at what the overall characteristics of the population are and compare them to who is in your sample? Because that might, if it's the working women who aren't responding, you might actually overstate the gender gap. And also next time we should have our conference in Curacao.
Good idea. Actually, this paper, the Visit Al paper, does describe the composition of who is in the panel and who self-selects themselves to be in the panel. However, what we do ask is when you go into the panel that you're the head of the household. And we do see that we have pretty much almost a 50-50 females versus males. And we do ask them, are you in charge of the household finances? So I do not show them here, but we also ask that. So we're asking the person that actually knows more about the household finance.
Other questions? Okay, I have one. Yesterday, you may recall, or even earlier this morning, there was this debate about the first two questions versus the big three as a fuller entity. And when I was reading that paper, I noticed two things. One is you do a really nice job of explaining that financial markets are still developing in Curacao. And also that you've changed question 3 in a way that seems to make a lot of sense given that. And now it says, what do you think is safer, investing in one business or multiple businesses? I just wanted to suggest that this might be a different question than the stock market question because there's limited liability when I invest in stocks, and when I invest in businesses, there's much higher liability. I can lose everything. I can be liable even beyond my investment. And also it's a much more illiquid investment. And so a person might think, gosh, I'm going to have to do a lot of monitoring if I invest in a business. And so trying to do that over multiple businesses might actually be harder. So I actually think this is a pretty good result after you, and I would just offer that.
This question was actually from the S&P Global FinLit, and those questions were made a bit more appropriate for less developed countries. So I understand that that's why we did not choose, also for brevity, the stock one, because of also not having a very well developed. But I would be curious if we ask the stock one, what the result will we get on the islands.
And then just one other thing. I think Carly's got a great question there too. But if you go back into the field as you're intending to, that might help to address some of that.
Yes.
And I wonder if you wouldn't also then ask some time duration questions. Like, it would be interesting to see if people with better financial literacy did a better job adapting from post-COVID. So you have these great questions pre-COVID, and for the population, the 225 or 224, you could see whether or not those with financial literacy bounce back better. That would just be so cool to see.
Yes, thank you for the suggestion.
I want to continue on that. I think it's so important. We know a lot about financial literacy, I think, in the developed country, right? And I think people sometimes are skeptical on the developing countries because they think there are so many other priorities and so on. But in fact, having this knowledge can be also important because, how you make your money last in those cases can be critically important, and it might have a bigger effect on your well-being. And so I have to say this is one of the reasons why we have also chosen paper that look, beyond, the G20 countries. So not to mention it's a great island.
Thank you so much.
All right. Next, let's have Josie Shao, and she'll be presenting our retirement planning tools, substitutes or complements to financial planning.
Thank you guys for including our paper. It is a great conference, and I'm really honored to be here. My name is Josie. I am a fifth-year PhD student at Claremont Graduate University. Our paper is titled "Our Retirement Planning to Substitute or Complements to Financial Capability." This is joint work with Gopi Goda at Stanford, Matthew Levy at LSE, Colleen Flaherty Manchester at University of Minnesota, and Aaron Sojourner at Upjohn Institute, and Joshua Tasoff at Claremont Graduate University. We have a really long list of co-authors. So it goes without introduction saying that the defined contribution plans playing an increasingly important role in the U.S. And these type of plans for retirement saving wealth accumulation. And these type of plans largely place the responsibility of retirement savings decisions onto the individual. However, we know that determining how much to save for retirement is a really complicated problem, probably from your own experience, but also there is a large body of literature that suggests that the savings behavior for retirement savings wealth accumulation is not optimal. This could be multiple reasons. It could be for low rates of financial literacy concept. We know there's just a large reliance on the default provisions, and all of the behavioral biases, exponential growth biases, present biases, and the low financial literacy kind of contributes to the low retirement savings. And in order to, address this issue, there are some potential ways we can approach this, right? There are the nudges or the choice architectures that we've heard about. There is this information intervention that Tabia's paper yesterday briefly, described, extensively described. And there's papers on peer effect. For any of the paper to when designing any of this kind of papers, what we want to do is we want to consider the following key questions. Namely, what factors determines users to use these type of tools? What are the average effects? Namely, how do people respond to this kind of interventions? And lastly, why people respond to these kind of interventions. Though there are less attention on this last why question, I would argue is one of the most critical questions we want to think about, primarily for welfare considerations. Namely, how the responses to these kind of interventions offset these biases that we mentioned earlier. So what our approach is that we conducted a randomized control trial at a federal agency where we designed a retirement savings projection tool with a treatment that helps people convert retirement savings contribution and balances into income streams in retirement savings. And when we want to investigate who uses this kind of tools, what are the treatment effect, and lastly, what are the how does the effect vary by the biases we know that causes the suboptimum retirement savings, namely the exponential growth bias, EGB, we name it for short, present biases, and low financial literacy. And our RCT is registered with AA with the following registry number. So to preview our results, we found that there is so 48% of our samples select into the tools. We found that none of the observable characteristics affect the selection except for the pre-intervention contribution. On average, we find a modest increase of our tool that is comparable to this other line of literatures. Is about $147 and among those who use the tools. And lastly, we found that this is where I think is really interesting, is that the tools effect are most are stronger for those with high financial literacy and high education level. In another analysis, we did a financial capability factor. It's kind of echoing the same theme, but no effect found by these behavioral biases that we would expect to have effect. To position ourselves in the literature, there's extensive literature that documents the effect of retirement savings, from auto enrollment to anchoring peer effect. There's a great literature that does that. There's also some evidence that suggests that there's the financial education programs and interventions designed to address the low financial literacy. And lastly, in other contexts, for example, in health and prescription drugs and health cancer screening, there is some evidence to suggest that the uptake into, selection into the uptake among the low need populations, those who may not need it the most, actually end up selecting into the treatment. So our contribution is that we found a modest increase from the from the tool that helps people convert balances and contributions into retirement savings retirement income streams. We find a positive selection, and from our results, we conclude that retirement savings, our tool that helps people to save, and the financial capabilities are complement instead of substitute. So for policy implications, we think that any treatment that address one of these biases may not work in silo, and online real-time savings tools are less likely to increase savings amongst those who really need this kind of tools. That's the low saving or low financial literacy group. So to really quickly, just to recap our, I think we all know what expenditure growth bias and present biases are, but to really quickly, expenditure growth bias, the EGB, capture the individual's tendency to neglect compound interest or annuity. So on the green line, where a person perceive exponential growth accurately, we capture that as alpha is equals 1, whereas linearly is alpha equals to 0. And anywhere in between, that's our exponential growth bias takes the value in there. I'm not going to go, for time's sake, I'm not going to go greatly into the actual mathematic formula, but it's in our paper. You can go check it out. In a similar vein for as Luis's paper, we also measure present biases. We use the quasi-hyperbolic discount functions that from this we can extract beta and delta, where delta is the long run discount factor that is a trade-off between today and future dates, and the beta and alpha together, beta and delta together measures our time preferences. So let me go a little bit deeper into our experimental design and our data. So to give you a little bit of context, because our experiment are in the federal, with the federal agency, the federal employees equivalent of 401k is called Thrift Savings Plan. This is the defined contribution plan for federal employees. The base contribution is 1%. For the first 3%, the agency matches dollar for dollar, and the next 2% is 50 cents per dollar. So the maximum maximum contribution is $18,000 in 2017. This is where we roll out the experiment. For this particular agency, the default provisions for employees who are hired after 2010 August are automatically enrollment, but hired before August 2010 is the opt-in provision. So the when it's opt out default provisions, the automatic enrollment contribution rate is 3%. So I think many of our audience may be very familiar with the Office of Personnel Management, but for those who are not, this is the Human Resources and the Leadership Support Department for all federal agencies. Our experiment is only on the employees of OPM, not all federal employees. So, and then in our data, we have 5,472 employees, primarily based in DC, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. We have access to two sources of data: the administrative data, which encompass the HR records, as well as their payslip TSP contribution pre and post our intervention. We also had a survey filled out before we rolled out our intervention that solicited a lot of these behavior biases that we were interested in. So for in our survey, how we elicited exponential growth bias is via a 3-question elicitation, and then we. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more, but for time's sake, we just we take the alpha and then we average it across the 3 questions. Similarly, we use a time staircase procedure from Falconall to estimate time preferences. That is either the present future staircase or the future staircase. For example, would you rather receive $100 today or X dollars in 12 months? And then we know that the no stake elicitation are highly correlated with stake elicitation. And then we did that for 5 questions for each staircase, for both staircases, the order of which are randomized, and then we extract beta and delta from each questions and average it across each staircase, all the 10 questions, basically. For financial literacy, we use the Big 5 question. I think our audience are pretty familiar with the Big 5. I won't go into great detail, but how we measured financial literacy is that we counted how many questions out of the 4 questions that an employee get correct, and then we standardize it within our sample. Just to give you a little bit context, the OPM employees on average actually perform relatively better than our general population. There's about 30% 30% of employees who answered all 5 questions correct. So I'm not going to go into other survey measures. So let me talk a little bit about the intervention. So as I mentioned before, it is a retirement savings projection tool that our treatment arm project the retirement savings projection based on the TSP contribution and current balances, and the pension and the other social security like group all together and produce a prediction. Whereas our active control group also see a prediction, but in the active control group, our tool did not convert the TSP contribution and balances. Instead, we just show, remember you have a TSP. So both versions of the tool allow the user to interactively adjust inputs. We can dynamically see how results change. There's no cap on how many times a person can interact with the tool. Also, there's an option for them to export a result and make adjustments. So just to reiterate, the key differences between the treatment and the control is that our treatment tool really removes the need for somebody to make that exponential growth calculation. Therefore, it really converts the balances and contribution into the retirement savings stream. So here's a screenshot of the active control group, active control condition, where you see the green and yellow is the Social Security and the FERS calculation plus a TSP, whereas in the treatment condition, we have an added teal bar that is the calculated amount, how TSP, the current TSP balance and the contribution translate into retirement savings stream. Really quickly, we did the survey before we rolled out the intervention between March and April of 2011. This is our email surveys. So our response rate is about 24%. And then in December 2017, we roll out this experiment. We also did a factor analysis because we have a rich set of data just to reduce the dimensionality, to explore heterogeneity. And then we retained 6 factors. I'll go in a little bit into details into what those are when we see the results. But these are the these are the data we use to generate those factors. So first of all, our first question is what result into the selection, right? So first of all, we observed that 46% of our users select into the tool participation. Among our survey respondents, there's 67% of them select into tool. So to test whether the selection is really like what's going on with this selection, we estimate a logit model where our dependent variable is whether or not the person participated in the tool or used the tool, and then our explanatory variables are those biases or our characteristics from our data. So what we found is that the only characteristics that are significant or correlated with the tool participation is their pre-intervention TSP contribution. No other observable characteristics are seem to influence tool use, and it's specifically one standard deviation in increase in the standard in the TSP contribution contributes to 32% increase in likelihood to use the tool. Next up, we estimated the treatment on the treated. This is comparing the treatment group relative to the active control group among those who use the tool in a definitive framework. So what we found on average, our treatment increased retirement savings by $174 relative to the control group on the tool user. This is about 2.3% relative to the mean. When we break out by heterogeneity, we found that the most those with higher standard financial literacy and those with higher bachelor educations save more under the tool, while there's no other. It's very noisy, but there's no effect for those if we just break out by this behavioral biases. Lastly, the similar result is echoed in our principal component analysis, where financial capability is the only factor that seems to be, driving the treatment effect. In fact, it makes it a little stronger. So, in summary, we find that. In terms of selection, this one standard deviation increase in the pre-intervention contributions leads to 32% likelihood increase in how a person engages in the tool. We find overall providing an information regarding the conversion between balances and contributions and retirement savings income leads to a higher contribution. It's a modest increase, $147, but it is comparable and in the same percentage-wise in the same line of this other literature. And we found that, higher financial literacy associated with a higher treatment effect, and there's a similar effect from the PCA analysis, but the other biases doesn't seem to stick. So really quickly for policy implications, this has actually come to us as a really big surprise, because when we designed these tools, we're expecting this tool to mitigate exponential growth bias, but it turned out there's no really effect. So this is really suggesting that these kind of biases and financial literacy never really work in silo. There's the interconnectedness of these kind of concepts, right? So addressing these behavioral biases really is an important object, but when we're designing this kind of tools, we need to consider them all together instead of a single one by one. And I'll stop here because I know I'm out of time, but I'll be happy to answer some questions, and I'll be happy to hear some feedbacks.
All right, we have just a minute for questions. We went a little over. Any questions? Carly? Oh, go ahead.
I have a quick consideration. So Actually, this is very consistent with other evidence. If you look at financial advice, right? You think that financial advice should be substitute for financial literacy, and we find this complement in the same way of the tool. So the people who use financial advisor are people with higher financial literacy, right? So again, to show that, you know, when you are looking at the people with the low financial literacy, maybe the tools are not, you know, like people have to know how to use it and so on. And so I think the design has to be right different. And I think this study is, of course, very important to, you know, to
Absolutely.
do
And
that.
I think even though our population do perform better than our general population in terms of financial literacy, is still that we need to make, well, in the future, whoever thinking about designing the kind of tools or really need to consider, you know, the accessibility, well, not accessible, but like how the low financial literacy group and things like that.
Just one other quick thing. You know, if you look at the theoretical model of financial literacy as well, we have to be careful in expecting that if you offer something, it will be taken up, right? Sometimes the optimal response is zero. In particular, in the low-income people and the low literacy, I mean, these people might have a lot of liquidity constraint, and it might not be optimal, by the way, to put money into an illiquid asset. Right. And so, you know, like, I think sometimes we always expect a positive response, but, you know, we have to be careful about that as well.
That's a fair point, and that's a great point. I should be more clear about that. Thank you.
And I would just add very quickly that, in fact, you'll see in the notes that one of Anna Maria's papers with Michaud and Mitchell is a suggestion, which I think gets to that point. Also, your results with respect to seniority, I think, resonate with the points that have been made in terms of keep hope alive. Once people have balances, they seem to respond pretty well. And with that, let's get to paper number 3. This is, we're pleased to have Sebastian Gomez Cardona, and he'll be speaking on fertility, financial literacy, and household portfolios.
It's on. Okay. Hi. Thank you to the organizers for including the paper in the program. Am I going in the right? That's the right direction. Yeah, I think I'm close. Am I close? No? That's the one. Okay. Yes. Yep. Thank you. So it's this way. Okay. Okay. So thank you for including the paper. So this paper is about fertility, financial literacy, and household portfolios. So I think, again, I don't have to explain too much to you about how financial literacy is very important in many decisions in household finance, not only in the accumulation of wealth, but in the access to several assets, such as stocks, in increasing the returns of some of these assets, and very importantly, in facing income shocks. However, little is known about how financial literacy relates to the speed of adjustment of household portfolios, which can be very relevant when households face some type of shocks. And I will be very, very concrete on the type of shocks that I will analyze. So the questions that I'm trying to answer with this project is, first, if there is any relationship between financial literacy and the speed of adjustment of household portfolios. And if this is the case, can financial literacy dampen the negative effects of some shocks? So to answer these two questions, I'm going to use changes in household portfolios around changes in fertility. And this is going to help me for 3 main reasons. So basically what I'm doing here is using fertility as a magnifying glass to understand the relationship between financial literacy and the speed of adjustment of household portfolios. So this is going to help me for 3 reasons. The first one is I document, as we might all expect, there is an adjustment towards housing in household portfolios when they have a child. This is important because for most households, housing is a very important part of their wealth. And second, housing is subject to adjustment cost, which might make financial literacy even more relevant for households. Second, I document some differences in the adjustment towards housing when there are changes in fertility, and these differences across the wealth distribution are going to allow me to talk about the relative importance of financial literacy for households in different parts of the wealth distribution. And finally, I'm going to be able to differentiate between planned births and unplanned. I'm going to be more precise of what I classify as an unplanned birth. And I'm going to interpret unplanned births as shocks to households. I'm going to evaluate if financial literacy can provide some sort of protection to these shocks. And these type of shocks are even more relevant today because they are more likely to happen after the overturn of Roe v. Wade. So basically, there are 4 main contributions of this paper to the literature. I would say there are the first 2 related to financial literacy. So first, the first one is about the role of financial literacy in the speed of adjustment of household portfolios when I include illiquid assets such as housing. Second, on how financial literacy can provide some sort of protection to shocks, in this case, fertility shocks, which are shocks very persistent and very high magnitude. And the last two contributions are more related to the relationship between fertility and the household portfolios. So first, I include illiquid assets in household portfolios. I analyze how these portfolios understood more broadly can change when there are fertility changes in households. And finally, I am able to speak about how fertility shocks can change household portfolios in general. So very briefly about the data that I use and the estimation. So I use mainly 2 data sets, PSID and the SCF. So the advantage of the PSID is that it is a panel, so I can follow households before and after having a child. I use the PSID since 1998, when they first included questions on household assets. And the second very important thing about PSID is that since 2012, they include questions on the birth, and I will use those questions to distinguish between planned and unplanned births. On the SCF, of course, these are cross sections, it's not a panel, but I will use differences in the age of children to see how households adjust their portfolio through their child's life. And second, the SCF in the last 2 waves includes questions on financial literacy, so I will classify households between high and low financial literacy. So the assets that I consider for household portfolios are these six assets. I will focus on my empirical part and in the model on the 2 highlighted assets, which are liquid financial assets different from stocks. So these are savings and checkings accounts and mutual funds. And in housing, so I focus on these 2 because those are the ones that present the highest changes when there are changes in fertility. So to talk a little bit about the estimation, I estimate both a TOWIT and a LOGIT. So in the TOWIT, I'm trying to understand how the share of these assets changes before and after the birth of a child. So this, of course, includes the intensive and extensive margin of the adjustment. To look only at the extensive margin, I estimate LOGITs, which have a dependent variable for owning one of these assets. And of course, I control in all of these regressions for many observables, including the age squared, marital status, the position in the wealth and the income distribution, and I will be able to analyze the path before and after the birth of children. So I'm going to describe the 4 most important results. So the first result is about family size effect. And as we might all expect, there is an increase in the share of housing in household portfolios when they have a child. So that increase is around 9%. And that increase in housing comes with a decrease in many other assets, in particular with a decrease of around 4% in the liquid financial asset. Now, the second result is about the expected, so birth are expected events, of course, most of them, not of course, most of them. And what I find is that households tend to begin this adjustment of their portfolios towards housing around 4 years before having a child. The third result, which is probably the most important one, is about the heterogeneity that I observe in the interaction between financial literacy and the position of the household in the wealth distribution. So what I find is that financial literacy tends to accelerate the adjustment towards housing of household portfolios in the middle of the wealth distribution. So I divide the wealth distribution into terciles. So in the middle of the wealth distribution, those parents with high financial literacy tend to adjust their portfolios towards housing faster than parents with low financial literacy. Now, in the bottom of the wealth distribution, so in the lowest tercile, parents with high financial literacy actually delay the adjustment towards housing. And this could be related to liquidity constraints, which is something that I can replicate with my model that I will describe in the next slide. And finally, in the highest tercile of the wealth distribution, there is no difference between parents with high and low financial literacy, so they basically adjust their portfolio towards housing at the same speed. Now, the last empirical result is related to fertility shocks. So, as I said at the beginning, I can distinguish between planned and unplanned births using the PSID. So my benchmark definition is, since 2012, the PSID included questions on if the birth was wanted or not. So that's the literal word, wanted. So on my benchmark definition, I classify unplanned births if the mother answered that the birth was unwanted. So I also have a rosehness check in which I use answers to the question about if the mother was using contraceptive methods by the time she got pregnant, and then I classify unplanned births as those births in which the mother was using any contraceptive method by the time she got pregnant. In any case, what I find is that when a household is hit with one of these shocks, so they have an unplanned birth, the effect is the opposite of the effect of planned birth. So in this case, the share of housing actually decreases. And I'm able to replicate that in my model, basically because households will be liquidity constrained, and so they have to decrease the share of housing and increase the share of their liquid assets in order to face the increase in expenditures. So let me briefly explain, the model. So to analyze welfare and some policy implications, I estimate a model. It's a life cycle model in which households can consume 2 goods, a durable good and a non-durable consumption good. Fertility increases the marginal utility of both goods. And the durable good is subject to an adjustment cost, which is very standard in the literature. So households can also save using a financial asset. And I take financial literacy and fertility as exogenous. However, I draw these two characteristics, financial literacy and fertility, from a multivariate distribution that has the same correlation that I observe in data. The way that financial literacy enters in the model is that this financial asset in my benchmark model is a risk-free asset, and the high financial literacy simply implies a higher return in that asset. I also have a version of the model in which the financial asset has stochastic returns, and the financial literacy decreases the volatility of those returns. So the mechanism behind the results in the model is that households with high financial literacy are able to accumulate wealth faster, and so they can overcome the adjustment cost of buying housing easier than those who have a lower financial literacy. And so this will result in different portfolio outcomes for parents with low and high financial literacy. Sorry, not portfolio outcomes. Different speed of adjustment in the portfolios of parents with high and low financial literacy. So I will talk about two main results that I have from the model so far. So the first one is financial literacy and welfare. So of course, financial literacy increases welfare. But what I find is that the increase in welfare for parents with high financial literacy compared to parents with low financial literacy is twice as much as the increase in welfare for households without children. And this speaks about the interaction between fertility and financial literacy and its importance. And the second, about fertility shocks. So these fertility shocks are more likely to occur in the poorest households, which is something that my model also accounts for. And these fertility shocks increase the need for liquidity, so they lead to different allocations. So I compare how parents who face a planned birth, how they do compared to parents with an unplanned birth. And what I find is that those with high financial literacy that get a fertility shock are actually able to compensate between 10 and 35% of this loss in welfare because of this unplanned birth, which is I interpret as a fertility shock. So to conclude, let me highlight the 5 most important points that the 5 most important conclusions that I get with this project. So first, I document that fertility comes with an adjustment towards illiquid asset, in particular housing, that the speed of adjustment depends on financial literacy, and in particular, its interaction with borrowing constraints. And the fourth, financial literacy can play a larger role in increasing household welfare for households with children. And finally, financial literacy can also diminish the negative effect of unplanned births. I think I finished right on time, right?
Yeah, okay, we have a question over here. Yeah, I think you can use your mic if you want to.
Interesting paper. I keep thinking of this paper that's in the Journal of Public Economics by Lisa Detling and Melissa Carney, who look at the effect of house prices on fertility decisions. And they find that when prices go up and you have more home equity, you're more likely to have children. So I'm wondering if like some of this is the rebalancing is just home equity and all timing of stuff at the same time, and how we think about that in general for poorer households who are unlikely to own homes.
Right. So
period.
yeah. So I estimate both the TOEIC and the LOGIT. So in the case of the TOEIC, that includes the share of housing. So that in that case, it could be related to simply an increase in the housing prices. But in the case of the LOGIT, it's only about owning or not owning a house. So that shouldn't be contaminated by that. I also control for state fixed effects and time fixed effects. So that kind of controls for that. But I think like the best answer is that the results in the LOGIT follow basically the same pattern.
But I think it would be helpful to understand if it's more housing consumption. Like, are you buying a bigger house? Are you sizing up? And is that different based on financial literacy, or is it just that now you have timed everything right? You have more equity in your home, and it's kind of that whole decision all in once. It's kind of hard to conceptualize.
Yeah. So what I should do is to decompose that effect into the extensive and intensive margin. That's what you're getting at, right?
And not to give you another data set to work with, but the American Housing Survey has a lot about specifics of the house. So you can see like number of bedrooms and all these other characteristics. So you could maybe, I don't know that that's necessarily what you want to do, but you could use another data set to kind of back up your findings in the PSID.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about the housing market, right? I live in LA. So if there is a way to think about how you control for neighborhood characteristics, right? I know with the HRS, you can work with the restricted version with the geocodes, right? And the PSID, I never worked with it, but I'm sure it's similar. No? But yeah, anyway, neighborhood characteristics are important. And then if you have thought about any heterogeneity by race and ethnicity?
I plan to do it, but I haven't done anything about race. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sebastian. Follow-up of the follow-up. So actually, and a minor comment additional. So I was thinking about the same point of Carly about which is the role of the economic cycle. So you change your portfolio composition dependently on the economic cycle, and probably also the perspective of a new birth can be biased by the economic cycle in terms of desire of this new birth. So it would be interesting. I know that you already replied to me some extent saying that you included time fixed effects. It would be very interesting looking at also these time fixed effects if they have a role in explaining why, because people say they didn't want that birth. And the second point, what a more methodological point is, when you define a household as poor in terms of wealth, I was curious if you equivalize, so you divided the wealth by the an equivalent scale, just to distinguish between people with 0 children, 1, 2, 3 children, and so on. Because of course, in that case, the well-being is different, equivalized. Thanks.
Right. So in data, I could see the changes from no children to 1 child and to 2 children and so on. Most of the effect occurs from no children to 1, and that I have the results. I don't think I have them in the appendix. In my model, I try to shut down many other channels, so I only have households who have 1 child, and I don't consider any heterogeneity in the number of children. But it's true that most of this effect comes from the first child.
Okay, any other questions? Going once, going twice. Done. Great paper. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have just a couple of announcements to make. And first of all, let me just say we are very excited to host this session about the rising scholars, because I think it's always important to see like the new and upcoming research and to see like the great work that young people are doing, and do consider that, you know, we really do want to grow the next generations of young researchers. So very exciting to see all of the work that is happening. In case you have to leave early, which I do not recommend because the next section also is going to be very interesting, we would love if you could fill out the evaluation in your folder. And if you have lost your folder, like me, you have other folder, and, you know, ask Anna or Anushka or somebody, and they will give you one. And I don't think they will let you exit without filling the evaluation. I'm kidding. But because we always like to, you know, get your insight, to know even like topic for next year. We do get, I call Anna and say, just call a hotel in Curacao and see if they have opening for the next cherry blossom and things like this. So we take your comments very seriously, and we are very happy to do so. I know we are only 10 minutes late, and there is no way we wanted to cut this young researcher. We could have even gone a little later. I'm kidding. I know you want the coffee. So, you know, I think we can accommodate really the 10 minutes late. So let's take another 15 minutes break, because I want all of you to be well caffeinated, but also because it's always nice to interact, you know, talk to people. If you have comments for these, you know, bright researcher, go and talk to them and so on. And remember that they also have the poster outside. So I would recommend go back to the poster. So, you know, we can, some of us have other ideas now, and we can give you comments and so on. And if you like to take a picture, you know, just tell him and say, hey, I would like, you know, take a picture. We have taken a lot of picture of you, but still we would love to take more picture. So, okay, let's have a break.